In this lecture, which I've broken up in two parts, I want to talk about how we're going to represent conditionals and negation in our logical system. Let's start with negation. One important sentential connective found in English that I didn't mention last time was not, or as it's sometimes expressed in English with the phrase, "it is not the case that." So we'll call the sentential connective not, or "it is not the case that," a sentential connective, even though unlike the other examples we looked at, it is not used to join two declarative sentences together. Rather, what this connective does is it operates on an original declarative sentence in such a way as to make a new sentence that expresses the negation of the proposition expressed by the original sentence. That is, it operates on the original sentence in such a way as to make a new sentence that expresses a proposition that is true when and only when the proposition expressed by the original sentence is false. So take the sentence, "It is raining," for example. Obviously, combining this sentence with not, as in "it is not raining," or slight variant, combining it with "it is not the case that," as in "it is not the case that it is raining," results in a sentence that expresses the negation of the proposition expressed by the original sentence. It's obvious, that is, that the proposition expressed by "it is not the case that it is raining," or equivalently "it is not raining," is true when and only when the proposition expressed by "it is raining" is false. Obvious and pretty straightforward. Now your textbook uses this symbol here, this dash symbol, to abbreviate negation. That is, if we let P abbreviate "it is raining," your textbook would abbreviate "it is not raining," or equivalently "it is not the case that it is raining," as this dash P sentence. Personally, I have a slightly different preference. I prefer to symbolize negation with the symbol tilde. I also think on some keyboards, at least, that it's easier to type than the long dash symbol. So if we let P abbreviate "it is raining," I would abbreviate "it is not raining," or equivalently "it is not the case that it is raining," as tilde P. So this is how I'm going to do things in the class, although you can choose whichever convention you prefer. Okay, now one thing to note about what I just did here is notice that when I wanted to symbolize "it is not the case that it is raining," the first step I took was to pick a single letter, in this case the letter P, to abbreviate the sub-sentence "it is raining." In general, in propositional logic, we use letters from the latter part of the alphabet, P, Q, R, and so on, to abbreviate or stand in for declarative sentences. And in propositional logic, we'll call these letters propositional variables because they stand in for declarative sentences that express propositions. Okay, that was negation. It's pretty straightforward. Let's move on to something that's a little bit more complicated, and that is conditionals. So the first thing I want to examine is what the parts of a conditional are. So when you have a conditional of the form "if P, then Q," the first subsentence, the sentence that's in the P slot, is called the antecedent of that conditional. And the second subsentence, the sentence that is in the Q slot, is called the consequent. In English, there are also different kinds of conditionals. An important distinction between two different kinds of conditionals in English is the distinction between indicative conditionals and subjunctive conditionals. So compare the following two conditionals. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, then someone else did. That's the first one, C1. Compare that with the second one, C2. If Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, then someone else would have. C1 is obviously true. But you'd have to be some sort of conspiracy theorist in order to confidently believe C2. C1 is an example of an indicative conditional. C2 is an example of a subjunctive conditional. An indicative conditional like C1 is typically assertable if one has good reason to believe that the consequent is true on the assumption or supposition that the antecedent is true. So clearly, since Kennedy was shot, it must be the case, supposing that Oswald didn't shoot him, that someone else did. And so we feel confident in asserting that if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, someone else did. Now, as we'll discuss later on in the class, there's some reason to think that the conditions under which an indicative conditional is true and the conditions under which one may assert an indicative conditional actually come apart. You might think that's a little odd. You might think that if a conditional is true, then you can go ahead and assert it. But there's some reason to believe otherwise, and I just want to flag that here. That is a topic to be discussed later on. Subjunctive conditionals like C2, by contrast, are typically assertable when we have good reason to suppose that had the world been different in the ways required to make the antecedent of the conditional true, the antecedent would have been true. So if one were to confidently assert that if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have, one likely believes that Oswald did in fact shoot Kennedy, and one's imagining what would happen had things been different. So if you were to confidently assert that if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have, then you might think, for example, that there were two shooters in the wings, so that had it been such that Oswald missed, the other individual would have been the one who shot Kennedy. In any case, if you didn't think anything like that was true, then you wouldn't be inclined to assert that if Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, someone else would have. So with the first conditional, we take for granted the facts that we know to be the case. We know that Kennedy was shot. So we know that if in fact Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, then someone else did. So the first conditional is an indicative conditional, and when we're assessing whether we are to assert it, we take for granted the facts we know. We assess, given those facts, what must have been the case on the assumption that Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy. For the second conditional, we might very well confidently believe that Oswald did shoot Kennedy, but in light of the facts we know, we consider what the world would have been like had things just been slightly different, or had things been minimally different enough so it turned out to be the case that Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy. And then we think about what would have been the case had things been different in that way. So that's the difference between indicative conditionals and subjunctive conditionals. In this class, we're only going to be concerned with arguments that employ indicative conditionals. I mentioned subjunctive conditionals only to set them aside. There are logical systems that treat subjunctive conditionals, but those are beyond the scope of this course. Okay, so there are various ways in which English expresses indicative conditionals. The paradigmatic way, or a paradigmatic way in which English expresses an indicative conditional is by way of a sentence of the form, if P, then Q. But there are other ways in which English does this. For instance, English often uses the phrase only if for this purpose. In fact, an English sentence of the form if P then Q is logically equivalent to an English sentence of the form P only if Q. For example, a sentence, if it is raining, then the streets are getting wet, is logically equivalent to it is raining only if the streets are getting wet. Another way in which English expresses indicative conditionals is via the phrase unless. In fact, the English phrase unless is logically equivalent to if not. So a sentence of the form P unless Q is equivalent to a sentence of the form P if not Q, which is in turn equivalent to a sentence of the form equivalent to a sentence of the form if not Q, then P. So we move from P unless Q to P if not Q to if not Q, then P. These are all logically equivalent expressions. Okay, so that ends the first part of this lecture. In the second part of the lecture, I'm going to take some of the things we learned about how English expresses indicative conditionals and talk about how we use those facts to translate claim or English sentences involving indicative conditionals into our logical symbolism.